Think China, 24th of October 2023, Australia-China relations are warming up once more, but will they last? Australia was subjected to 3 years of bullying by China when it demanded an investigation into the use of biological warfare by China against the globe, for which China must reimburse Australia. A shift in the tone of relations between China and Australia is shown by the recent release of Chinese-Australian news presenter Cheng Lei and the removal of tariffs on major Australian exports to China. But will the improving ties and the restart of talks and trade last, given the influence of foreign geopolitical challenges and China-US relations on China-Australia bilateral relations? The China desk of Lianhe Zaobao investigates the matter. After being held in China for 3 years on accusations of national security, Australian news presenter Cheng Lei, who was born in China, was finally freed. On October 11, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced that Cheng had come home and reconnected with her family. Penny Wong, the Foreign Minister of Australia, had personally met Cheng at the airport. Wang Wenbin, a spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, responded to questions by saying that Cheng had been found guilty of giving state secrets to a foreign party without authorization, receiving a sentence of 2 years and 11 months in prison as well as deportation. The Beijing Municipal State Security Bureau removed Cheng from the nation after she completed her sentence. On August 13, 2020, Cheng vanished. A month later, China put him under residential surveillance at a designated location for reasons of national security. China detained her in February 2021 on allegations of transferring state secrets abroad illegally. Cheng worked as a news anchor for CGTN, the English-language channel of Chinese state media at the time. China-Australia ties were at an all-time low at the time. To China's chagrin, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison demanded an international investigation into the causes of the COVID-19 outbreak. Beijing responded by placing trade restrictions on coal, wine, and barley exports from Australia. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation stated that Cheng's case was related to the conflict between China and Australia. Thawing relations. Since assuming office in May last year, Australian Labor Party leader Albanese has adopted a practical strategy to enhance Australia-China relations. The Australian foreign and trade ministers have both visited China, high-level bilateral talks have been resuming, and Albanese even had a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping last November during the G20 meeting in Indonesia. In addition, Beijing has negotiated a settlement with Australia to end their spat over barley imports into China and lifted duties on Australian coal and lumber. Beijing also declared that it would re-evaluate its taxes on Australian wine. Cheng's release represents the development in China-Australian relations, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry issued some positive remarks on October 11. Is China's hope that with this, Cheng Lei, case now resolved, there's an opportunity for better relations between Australia and China going forward? A reporter asked during a routine press conference held by the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Wang retorted that China has always taken a consistent and clear stance on the development of relations with Australia and that both countries stand to gain from a sound and stable partnership that also promotes regional and global peace and stability. China remains prepared to collaborate with Australia to enhance further and expand the two countries' bilateral relationship and yield greater advantages for both peoples, he continued. In his address at Asia Society Australia's Asia Briefing Live 2023 in Melbourne on October 11, Chinese ambassador to Australia Xiao Qian stated that China-Australia relations are at a turning point for a fresh start and that it is essential to maintain the solid and positive momentum of these ties while also promoting their further development. Xiao went on to say that there are more similarities than differences between Australia and China and that Albanese's trip to China this year will help to improve ties between the two countries. Since then, Albanese's visit has been confirmed for November 4 to 7. It will be the first visit by an Australian leader since 2016. While Albanese had previously stated that Cheng's release would not affect his ability to visit Beijing because travel should not be transactional, Australians had been putting pressure on authorities and urging the government to obtain Cheng's release prior to the Prime Minister's trip to China. In addition to relieving Albanese of domestic pressure, China's release of Cheng will foster goodwill ahead of his visit to China before the end of the year. Cheng, who was born in Yueyang, Hunan, in 1975, immigrated to Australia when she was 11 years old and went on to earn a degree from the University of Queensland. CGTN, CNBC, and CCTV are employed here. She expressed her want for sunlight in an open letter sent this August through Australian diplomats, adding, "I haven't seen a tree in 3 years." More analysts cited a Reuters story that although Cheng's release represented a turning point in China-Australia ties, there were still issues between the two countries. Moreover, there was no additional information available, and blogger Yang Hengjian, an Australian who was also arrested in China, is still incarcerated. Although Cheng's release represents a big step in normalizing Australia-China relations, Adam Ni, an independent analyst on China issues, stated that both countries need to put in more effort to achieve this goal because it is up to Beijing and Canberra to figure out the new normal in bilateral relations. Cheng's release, according to Ryan Neelam, head of the Lowy Institute's Public Opinion and Foreign Policy Program, is one of the more tangible indications that China is no longer punishing Australia for comments and policy measures that Beijing had objected to. It doesn't completely change the overall structural difficulties that have been present, he added. Hard to cut ties with China. Australia is reliant on China for trade and economic gains even as it draws closer to the US in terms of security. Despite ups and downs in recent years, China continues to be Australia's most important trading partner, with two-way goods trade expected to reach $287 billion Australian dollars, $195 billion US dollars, in 2022, or 28% of Australia's total international trade. By striking free trade agreements with India and the UK, as well as bolstering its investments and trade and economic links with Southeast Asia, Australia has attempted to lessen its need for China. However, this does not imply that Australia may completely cut ties with China. The South China Morning Post revealed in an article dated October 5 that Australian officials had carried out 3 distinct internal assessments over the previous 8 years. It concluded that it would be impossible to sever trade links with China entirely. According to the report, which cited unnamed sources, the decisions were reached unanimously and without bias, eventually supporting Australia's decision to resume economic relations with Beijing in the latter part of last year. Furthermore, research has demonstrated that Australia cannot successfully diversify trade away from China. Diversification to Southeast Asia is China plus, according to the source. Australia found other markets for some of its exports when it was subject to China's harsh trade restrictions. For example, it exported coal to South Korea, Japan, and India. Australia's Treasury estimates that exports to new markets climbed by $3.3 billion US dollars, essentially offsetting the $4 billion US dollars decline in exports to China, according to a report by Radio Free Asia. However, exports to China make up about 84%, 69%, and 80% of all Australian exports for 3 essential products: lithium, iron ore, and lobsters. The head of the University of Technology Sydney's Australia-China Relations Institute, Professor James Lawrence Sesson, said, "Telling these Australian exporters to diversify is silly and insulting." Australia's core policies regarding China. To ease tensions with China, cabinet members of the Albanese administration were more cautious than they had been under the Morrison administration when discussing the China problem in public. Key Australian ministers have repeatedly declared, "We will cooperate with China where we can, disagree where we must, but we will engage in our national interest," according to a remark by the Australian Policy Research Institute, the Lowy Institute. Penny Wong told Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in December while on a visit to Beijing that Australia and China could strengthen their bilateral ties and protect their respective national interests if they could navigate our differences wisely. "We have different political systems," she said. "Our nations have distinct interests. Prudentially managing such claims is a part of what the government does." Chinese researcher Cheng Lei, based in the U.S., stated that Australia should stop publicly criticizing China's political system and instead try to live together despite their differences by Wong's idea of navigating differences wisely. Fundamentally, the Albanese government's approach to China has been to adopt a political stance and stick to it when it comes to issues like human rights, but to refrain from intervening. This has meant that the government is committed to genuine efforts to advance economic and trade relations, encourage exports, and foster economic growth. In line with U.S. military and security policies, security concerns, however, continue to be the primary source of unhappiness in China-Australian relations. Under the AUKUS Trilateral Security Alliance, Australia, a U.S. ally in the region, has further integrated the U.S., UK, and U.S. security strategies. AUKUS is considered a counterweight to China's sway in the Indo-Pacific area. A report on the BBC's Chinese website states that, in line with agreements, Australia will purchase 3 U.S. Virginia-class submarines in the early 2030s, with options to buy 2 more, and the US and UK will begin deploying a small number of nuclear submarines in naval bases in Perth, Western Australia, starting in 2027. Along with the US, Japan, and India, Australia is a part of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Quad. Quad, under US leadership, is also viewed as a means of containing China. Following Wong's visit, an editorial in the Chinese state media, The Global Times, urged Australia to stop arbitrarily securitizing political relations and to stop forming confrontational and exclusive coteries in the region against China and adopt a rational perspective of China's peaceful development. It went on to say that all of these fall within the definition of stable relations with China. The editorial's reference to confrontational and exclusive coteries obviously refers to AUKUS and Quad, even though they weren't explicitly named. Yes, it is necessary to balance security and the economy. Regarding its China policy, the Albanese administration is taking a practical stance. It values its trade and economic ties with China but also views China as a geopolitical threat. The 2023 Lowy Institute poll echoes this sentiment as well. Resuming contact between Australian and Chinese ministers is viewed favourably by 56% of respondents to the poll, while 52% saw China more as a security danger than an economic ally. The China-US dispute is a significant external element that affects China-Australian ties and bilateral issues. Australia is a regional partner that the US may use to restrain China, and the country has never backed down from participation in security initiatives spearheaded by the US. The duration of the warming of relations between China and Australia will depend on how Australia manages its three-way relationship with the US and China and whether China and Australia can effectively resolve issues.